Hello, everyone. It's so good to see you all again. Thanks for coming to our week 4 series, RFP webinar series. We're really excited today because we have one of our favorite people in inclusive higher ed joining us today. She's a star, Julie Lackey. She comes from Oklahoma, and yeah, she has a parent perspective, and she's going to share a little bit more about what she does, but she's done some incredible work in Oklahoma, and we are just so excited to have her knowledge and her presence here with us today. Um, I am going to just get started here with some introductory um, inclusive higher ed things. All right, so. All right, can you all see my screen okay? Perfect. Welcome to week 4. It is February 12th, which is just amazing. 2 days from Valentine's. I know everyone's super excited about that. And we just want to start our time by acknowledging that that the land we're on currently, that Minnesota is on the rightful lands of the Dakota and other indigenous people. And we recognize that the US did not uphold their end of land treaties. And it's because of the continued displacement of indigenous peoples that allows the state of Minnesota to exist today and the land we are on currently with ICI and the property. Affirmation of commitment. Despite everything going on in the world, ICI is still committed to addressing systemic racism, ableism, and all other forms of inequities and forms of oppression to ensure inclusive communities. Next, we just have our webinar schedule. And we are in week 4 right now. So we will have 2 other guest speakers. And we're excited for both of them. We will have Jonathan from Missouri, and then we will have Mindy the week after, and she is from Think College, and she'll be joining us. So I'm going to stop my sharing. Perfect. And we are just going to dive in today. I want to give Julie enough time to share. She's not scary at all. So please feel free to ask any questions along the way. I think it works better when we do this more informally, and there'll also be time for questions at the end. But yeah, let's hand it over to Julie Lackey.
Thank you for allowing me to come and share. I always love to, talk, as anyone that knows me will verify. So I appreciate y'all's time, and I am going to share my screen. Make sure you can see it. Okay, can everybody see that? Great. Okay, so I am the director of what's called the OK-IPSY Alliance in Oklahoma. And so that is all about Oklahoma's inclusive post-secondary education world. We are a partnership between Oklahoma Rehabilitation Services, State Department of Education in Oklahoma, and a resource agency that touches most of our counties called Sooner Success. And they kind of connect the dots for anyone with any disability of any age. Pretty amazing organization. And so I'm also a parent. And so I have a lived and learned perspective as well as a professional perspective for what I do. And so just to give you a little bit of background before we get into our topic today. So what we do is really, really similar to what Mary and Katie do. It's all about capacity building with our alliance. And so educate is always first because from what Mary and Katie and I have talked about over time, we're really similar. I think most states are actually really similar in that, organizations and folks can be rather siloed. And so it's hard to get that information out there and make sure there's accurate information out there. So education is a big part of what I do all the time. I'm constantly traveling the state, talking to legislators, talking to anyone that pretty much will listen about inclusive post-secondary education, what it is, and what we're trying to do. So advocate, obviously, that's like breathing. Assist as the different programs we have in our state need something. They are incredibly, incredibly busy staff. They don't have time to, hey, can you find this out? Can you find this out? And that's what I do. Call me and I know a guy, right? And then collaboration, obviously, the name of the game. We can't do this by ourselves, and collaboration is so important. I say, gosh, this is so important. All these things are equally important, really. And so we pulled together all the folks you see on our little infographic there together and try to connect those dots and keep that information fresh and current. When we started this effort, there was lots and lots, and actually I will still say there is lots of information that's not correct about what a quality inclusive post-secondary education program is. And that's a big deal. Lots of making sure we're on message. The policymakers and our discussions and our relationships to legislators is a big deal. We recently passed a couple pieces of legislation that greatly expand the ability of these students to be able to afford college, because as we know, college is expensive, whether you have a disability or not. It's still expensive. So we worked to get a couple of pieces of legislation passed, which was a big win for these students. And so basically, we do anything to support IPSE programs and the students that they serve. That's what we're all about. And so what does Oklahoma look like right now? We look like this. We have 3 CTP designated programs for students with intellectual developmental disabilities. NSU is called the Riverhawk Scholar Program. It is a 4-year certificate program. OU has Sooner Works, which is a 4-year certificate program. And OSU has Opportunity Orange Scholars, which is a 2-year certificate program. So those are, again, CTP designated. I think you guys, have you all talked about CTPs yet? Did we know? Okay. Yes. Okay. So comprehensive transition programs. And so those are programs that are a non-degree programs. And then we also have what's kind of unusual is an autism support program that is for degree seeking students with autism. Now, that is not a CTP, but they are very unique in that they absolutely follow what we call the 4 pillars of wraparound service for these students. For this fairly small population of students with autism who are degree seeking, they can do all of the college program work, they can get a degree. And so they are pioneers as well. So obviously the programs are all incredibly good at those 4 pillars of enhancing independence. How independent can that student be? Let's support them to be as independent as they can be. Social engagement, obviously you can't do life without social engagement and doing it properly, right? Academics, if you're going to college, you're going to do academics. It's not just to hang out and party, although, hey, I went to college with a lot of people that did that too. But academics is part of it. And then obviously employment and that preparation for competitive integrated employment is so, so important. And so we have several good things in the works as well. We just had a grant opportunity come out. We have at least 2 programs that have applied for that. We also have a career tech pilot in the works. So we have more on the horizon in a fairly short order. So good things going on with that. So that's what Oklahoma looks like. I'm going to throw this up there for a minute and go right past it. But this is just, it's kind of the 6 very key components of building a program. I was fortunate to work with a couple people to write a piece for Think College. And this is kind of the process planning for getting a program up and going. And so that research, course of study, program structure, messaging, collaboration, and cost are kind of the big components that are kind of the hallmark of planning to get a quality program up and going. I'm not going to spend time on this because I know we only have X amount of time and I want to allow for questions. And as Mary and Katie know, I can talk. So want to keep it, kind of focused on what they asked me to talk about. Okay. So does anyone have any questions so far about Oklahoma, what I've just said? I just want to be sure. Just if you do throughout this, just jump in there. Because I'm not good at watching a chat. So if you have something to ask, please just ask. Multitasking, not great when I'm doing this. So, all right. So institution approved, that is a huge, huge 2-word statement. Okay. The credential component of these programs is so important. Mary and Katie asked me to talk about both the admissions process and sort of the credential and working with existing systems. So those are the 3 topics I'll kind of be hanging my hat on. But I went back and forth on which slide should I put first because they are so equally important. So this is not in order of importance, okay? But I thought we'd start with credential because first and foremost, you see my nice big red X through the word experience. It is not very positive for these students to use the verbiage or think in words of this is a college experience, okay? Because an experience downgrades the amount of work and the amount of focus and the amount of preparation and planning that these programs do with and for students. All right. So I always like to say we're not going to talk about this as a college experience. Okay. This is a college education. Now, whether it is a credential in an actual program that's already on campus, or whether it is a credential that is specific to the program, we'll talk about that in a minute, it is an education. These students are getting a full-on education in life. They really are. It is for all those 4 pillared items I just discussed. They're getting an education in independent living, social, academics, and employment. So the experience should not be, in my opinion, in our vocabulary. Okay. These students are getting college education. And so their credential needs to reflect that. And so, first of all, communication is going to be critical throughout all the things I'm going to talk about today, because if that communication is not going well between the staff and or the program planners and all the different entities within an organization, it's not going to be great. That communication is really important. There are programs that I do know of that have lived in a silo, and that's never very positive because they're never fully embraced by the university, right? And so that communication with all those different folks are very important. We'll pick that up in a couple slides down. But so the credential itself, is it following the national accreditation standards as far as what the program is offering? And so that credential is first and foremost following a course of study, okay? And so there is no credential without a course of study. So the first thing that goes into that credential is what is the course of study going to be? What does that look like? Is it going to be focused on, a certain area of expertise? Or is it going to be general education open to students that are wanting to learn whatever that particular university has to offer? And all universities, as we know, and all career techs, they have different offerings, right? And so you always want to look at what the strength of that university is doing and where that credential is going to land. And so who, I like to say, owns it, right? Where is the home of that credential? Is it coming from what office? A college of what? Is it coming from the College of Education? Is it coming from the College of Psychology? Is it coming from the College of Continuing Education? Where is the home? Because when programs sort of float and are not owned by an area in the college itself, then they're not really ever seen as part of the fabric of that university. And that's a big deal. We've got some examples. I've seen that we had a program that started kind of with a bang, but did not have really ownership of a particular college yet. And it was always, okay, but we'll get to there. We'll get there. Well, the problem is until they got there, it really didn't have footing in the university. Yes, it had sponsoring deans and it had sponsoring folks that were kind of carrying the flag, as it were. But without it having that home, it wasn't seen with equal importance as all the other programs. And that's a big deal because that's reflected on those students attending that program, right? And so you really want to have the credential being owned by, right? Having the home in a college that is very well established on campus. Now, I will say that if there's issues deciding that, sometimes the College of Continuing Education is a good home because that is still a respected part of a university, and a College of Continuing Education has more flexibility because it is for atypical learners already, right? It does a lot of different things. And so sometimes that's a good home. We do have one program that has that home, and that works very well because there's lots of ability to have different structure and different things going on that may be a little less strict, I guess. It depends on the university. And so what is already offered? When you're looking at, okay, I'm going to have this credential, what's offered? I mean, is there anything already in existing that can be modified? Because let's not try to reinvent the wheel as much as we possibly can, because any time that everything is created for this program, well, that makes it less and less part of the university. So I can't stress that enough. I'll probably say that several times, but being a part of what is already being done is really important. And so if there's an existing credential that is already in place, that's awesome. Can it be tweaked a little bit that also will allow for the course of study that these new IPSE students are doing? Or if you're looking at the possibility of a micro credential, what does that look like? I don't know, in your system, what that looks like. For instance, we're talking about to our career tech now about the micro credentialing because for instance, in small motor repair or early childhood, well, maybe there's 12 to 15 areas of expertise that this typical student has to do to get that credential at a career tech. Well, these students have an intellectual disability, and often they're not able to get all 12 to 15, but they sure can get maybe, 10. Maybe they can't do those last 3 or 4, but maybe they can do the first 10. So micro-credential may be something to explore that can be working for those students to get a credential that is recognized, that is by that IHE, Institute of Higher Education, but it is tuned for those students. So it is showing they have done rigorous coursework. It is showing they have expertise in this area, and it is showing a credential. And so what is the title of that credential? We've had large discussions at our universities on the title of that because there are 350 some odd things on Think College's website for these programs. Out of that, there's probably 150 or so that are really in the CTP designated area. And so that perception of that title is very important because you don't want it to be something that looks like it's just very specific to the Riverhawk Scholar Program or to Sooner Works. It needs to have a title that actually has some meaning. And I will say integrated community studies is something that's used quite often. It is also used in Oklahoma and it's used across the country. That really is showing general education, right? That student is able to have access to that course catalog and they're able to select the courses that they're interested in. And they are learning all about all of the things that go into the programs we talked about, the 4 pillars, right? And so that integrated community studies, along with that transcript, is showing expertise in whatever they wanted to study. Okay, so that title is important to think through that. It needs to have meaning, right? Meaning is so important. It gets away from that experience, right? It needs to have some meaning. And so for something that I was just using as the example for career tech, a micro credential, well, those can be industry recognized, absolutely. And so you want something that you have meaning to your future employers, right? And that also is an education effort that needs folks to be aware of these students, they're graduating, why that's important, what they're graduating with, what is that credential, and what does that credential mean? So it's not just, okay, student, graduate, here you go. It's also employers and the education that needs to be done in the state to help those employers know what's coming, right? That the students are getting this credential and what that means. And so the components aligning that get to that credential from the CTP designation is important to have alignment with the EAC components. That's important. And I look at the CTP designation, that is a floor to me. I really encourage everyone to think of it not as the goal. I really encourage thinking about it as the floor. Like all of our programs in Oklahoma, yes, those 3 are CTP designated, but they far exceed the criteria that a CTP would call for, like, 51% inclusion. Well, the students in our CTP programs are, more like 90% inclusion, right? And so you think of the components of a CTP, I would encourage you to think of that as the floor, because that just ensures those students are actually getting a full college experience. Okay, so the nuts and bolts of a credential. What is the mission? What's the mission of your program, right? What do you want that program to do for these students? Is it general flexible knowledge that they're getting a kind of an overall liberal arts experience of being able to take the classes they want? Is it just specific to occupations? We've got one of our programs that is looking at doing a course of study options because they're finding that lots of their graduates are really focusing on business or are really focusing on early education or really focusing on, whatever. And so, they're looking at the possibility of, okay, maybe we have this course offering that leads to this specialty. So what is your mission going to be at your program? What do you want these students to walk out with? And so really focusing on what that looks like is important because different universities do different things in different ways. And so everyone specializes in something. And so, that knowledge that you're giving that student by their work needs to be specific to whatever that university or that institute of higher education is good at, right? And so what is success? What does that look like? You know, the programs all need to have a really rigorous SAP, so those students are satisfactory academic progress. That's a big deal. Are they getting grades or are they getting pass fail? Even if they're auditing, what does that look like? We had one university that started with pass fail. And you know what? That didn't work well because it was difficult to really gauge performance. And so, you know, when that entity switched to grades, that worked much better because guess what? All those other students in that university were getting grades, right? And so these programs are built so students have to know how they're doing. And pass fail doesn't really let them know how they're doing. You know, it's not typical of all the other students. So, you know, that satisfactory academic progress is a lot easier to track when you have graded process like any other student. And that goes back to my saying, don't recreate the wheel, right? What is everyone else already doing? Professors will understand it better if, you know, those students are under a graded format, right? Because every other student is. And then that helps automatically, you know, a professor's brain think, okay, well, I mean, if they earned a D, they get a D. Can the students fail? You bet. You know, absolutely. Because this is college. And so that satisfactory academic progress process needs to be in place and be rigorous. CTP alignment, we already talked about. Oh gosh, I'm going long. I know I knew I would. Yes.
Julie, I do have
Yep.
just one question to interject on the
Yes.
SAP and taking classes for a letter grade as opposed to audit. In those situations, I know a number of colleges and universities that do that, but the grade is based on the individual student's learning agreement, which is typically um, uh, um, established at the beginning of a semester with the faculty member, the advisor, and the student, right? Is that
Correct.
what your experience has been?
Yes, that's exactly right. Because again, these students are in a CTP program are taking courses that are modified. Once you have modified course content, that student cannot earn the same credit that any other student can. But they are and they can earn whatever their satisfactory academic progress is. And so they have to be graded to help make sure they are tracking and making that progress, right? And so I recently was talking, like I said, we're having a career tech pilot starting, and you know, one thing that's a little bit different with a more hands-on career tech or vocational type focused process is the opportunity to take those courses and maybe they actually fail the first time. Well, you know, the try again. Okay, maybe that student needs to do that and do it again because they process differently, they learn differently, they need a little bit more time, and that's okay. So whereas maybe that's not so okay for a quote, you know, typically matriculating student, well, for these students, that's part of how the program's written, that if they needed to repeat XYZ of a course, they could, and it wouldn't go against them, right? And so they can earn that micro credential that way, but it may take them a little bit longer. So the definition of success is something that really does need to be thought through, because if you're not sure what it is, then that student for sure is not going to know what it is. And I'm just from experience and talking and working with so many folks, I mean, students do much better if they really understand what it takes to succeed and what is are areas that they shouldn't be going into, like speaking to the pass fail, right? Versus grades. So that's something to just spend some time with. The coursework is, I've kind of touched on that already. Inclusive classes are critical. It is kind of cool to see the different ways that's done. We've got one of our programs now that started with classes that were just for the students, and that can be fairly typical. There could be, for instance, the catalog of what a student is working with might be 2 course catalog classes of their choice that any student can take in the university, but then it also may be 1 class that is not inclusive, that is just for those students to help them with the things they need help with, like maybe healthy choices, maybe it's budgeting 101, that's not accounting, right? But it's at their level to help them do what they need to do, self-advocacy. And so it's really kind of been cool to see the change that, well, maybe this program started doing that, and then maybe there were other professors that said, I've got some students that could use that. And so, we've got programs now that have morphed into those being catalog classes, because you know what? That benefits more than just these students. I guarantee on every single campus, there are students that can benefit from, those type course offerings that maybe thought, oh, I think it's just for these IPSE students. Well, no, actually, there's folks that can benefit from that throughout, and that helps expand that ability to have the credential, right? Because and the inclusiveness, because then everybody can take those classes. Rigorous standards we've talked about. Quantity matters, and so this has been very interesting as we went through our legislation recently and got the scholarship legislation we just did. Well, that scholarship pays the equivalent of full tuition for all 4 years for a student. So that's tied to tuition, which is tied to classes, which is tied to the hours that student is taking. And so think in terms of what I just explained, right? We had courses maybe that were not inclusive. So those weren't considered through the university process as part of their course catalog. Therefore, they were not considered courses hours, right? And so when those exclusive classes turned into inclusive classes to include everyone, well, that actually raised the amount of scholarship money that students could receive, correct? Because maybe they were just getting the equivalent of 6 hours of course credit because they were taking two courses at a time. Well, if you then change things and you count the courses that they're taking for employment readiness and healthy choices or self-advocacy, well, now that's so quantity does matter, right? And how those courses are looked at by the university does matter. Does it go through the approval process with the university to be included, to be counted or not? And that's something to really, really think of. Think College does have, and I've got that link, and I'm going to get this set of slides to you guys after this, but there is a credential action planning tool that Think College has. It's very, very good. That gives all kinds of tips and process and understanding on how that goes. So I know I'm racing through this. Does anyone have any questions? Or did I confuse everyone completely?
Well, two things that I would just add, Julie. With the Minnesota standards,
Yes.
We have 100% academic inclusion, meaning classes are all coming out of the course catalog, period.
Perfect. Yes.
That is best practice. And the
Absolutely.
second is, I don't know how this works, and maybe it's by individual institution, but I know in some cases, for an inclusive higher ed initiative and their certificate, they actually identify the number of credit hours that is considered full-time. I know for my daughter that attended out of state, while
Yes,
she was taking 2 or 3 classes a semester, it was considered full-time. And so that was also reflective for any kind of financial aid and voc rehabilitation funding that she was able to access. So that's
yes,
another thing to look into when you're considering your credential and
that's true.
the student status in terms of the credit hours.
Yes, and that brought up something else I thought of is there was one of our universities that had a student that was going to join a sorority or fraternity. Well, what happens is there are bylaws that sororities and fraternities have, and part of that is that student had to be a matriculating student. And so I know this is really getting into the weeds, but you really have to think in terms of all these things. So what Mary just said about the full-time status, very, very important. And also the matriculating status. You know, you can't assume that the registrar is considering these programs to be students to be X or Y, right? You have to make sure that they are looked at as full-time students, as matriculating, as full access students, all those things that we think would be, well, I take that for granted. You can't, because, you know, that was something that this university never come up against on, well, of course they're matriculating. Well, were they? Because till that point, the registrar hadn't necessarily seen them that way. So that was a discussion and making sure then all of the, you know, I's were dotted and T's were crossed to make sure they were considered that, because otherwise they couldn't join a sorority or fraternity. So there's lots and lots of layers on, you know, don't assume students are full access, full time, fully matriculated, you know, make sure that status is part of the fabric of that program. Okay. Admissions. Wow. I knew I'd run long. I'll be quick. Okay, admissions. So same thing, institution approved, big deal. You really don't want to set up something that is a standalone thing. Now, admissions is tricky, and every university is very different. So just to have the conversations that kind of touch these areas is really important. And when you do that, that means you have to have everyone at the table of the advisory board that's planning these programs from the get-go. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But, you know, communication, again, I have that at the top because it literally will make or break every program without a doubt. So admissions. So is there an existing process that those students will be a part of? Now, maybe it's not right off the bat like every other student. Maybe there has to be something done first. I know we've got an example, for instance, that students have to really, the way it works best for this university is that they go through an application process that is a application that is particular to the program. And the reason for that is it's privacy, and it also is simplicity, right? Because these programs need documentation of diagnosis. These programs need, you know, paperwork, things that the regular admissions process may not need. These students also don't have maybe the required ACT or whatever scores that the application, the regular admissions needs. And so what's helpful, and to give you one example, is that students go through the application process that is particular to the program, and they actually are either accepted or not accepted. If they're accepted, the program staff then lets the registrar know, and the registrar sends an email link to that student. Now, what happens then, as an example, is they've taken the regular admissions application for the university that every other student does, but they've just taken out a couple of cells. Like, for instance, you know, you have a required ACT score of this. They don't have that, right? So they don't have that. And so they've modified that very slightly, not much, but just enough things that make sure there's not a hang up, if you will, right, for the IPSY program students. So the admission process, again, everything needs to be thought through, but super, super important to think that through, because I mean, I had one area that, well, could you even find the application, or could you find that program in that main university website, right? So that's part of that institution approved. If you're, Googling what you think the name of the program is, and it can't connect to the intelligence of the university website as a whole, that's a big deal. I know that seems silly, but it happens. And so, you want to really make sure that that admissions and application process will work with what the university is already doing, meaning that the admissions is nesting where the regular admission stuff is, meaning you can find that program application, so is there an existing process available? Can there be an existing process plus, right? So mostly existing, right? You're not wanting to recreate everything new, but these programs are unique, that the students do have different needs in some areas. And so you want to protect their information to some degree. And so, for instance, you might not want the registrar and admissions and everyone to have all that diagnosis information, right? Because it's only the program staff that needs that. And so that's why, I kind of like the existing process plus, because it seems to work well. It helps the application process go well, to make sure the IPSY student is a good fit for that program. And then once they're accepted, they can follow the same institution approved admission process with a couple slight changes. And so that gets them in there, it gets them registered, it gets them part of the system. So that's really, really important. And I will say that I can't talk about clarity on that process enough, because I think we've had more conversations with all the different programs about parents and clarity and understanding, and the students following what process do I follow, right? So it needs to be super clear, because you literally can hurt your recruitment if that's not clear, right? You can miss applicants if it's not clear on how they are able to get into admissions, and the application process be accepted or not accepted. What happens if they go through the application process and they're not a good fit for whatever reason? Making sure that process is continued to communicate back to that student, that they know, well, what happened? I didn't hear. Make sure that you close those communication loops. The documentation is varies with different programs. A lot of programs really require a whole lot of paperwork, a lot of documentation information, while other programs don't. And so what documentation do you need? What do you really need? There's been programs that have started with a ton of documentation, but really, they really don't need that. What is your goal for these students? What is your program outline looking like? And what documentation do you really need? Things as simple as, I need a copy of your high school graduation, right? Well, what if that person was homeschooled? What if they were virtual school, and their credential at the end of high school looks different? So, being very cognizant of the wording that's asked for on what is required. Maybe just showing completion of high school, that covers everything, right? And so, that's better wording than wanting your high school credential, right? So being cognizant of that. Documentation of disability, references, how many, what type, do you need a video, what kind of video, how long? I mean, it's like you kind of take your grand idea and you really break it down. And then the deadline dates, the driver for that is enrollment, because if these students are not enrolling when every other student is, they're going to have classes that aren't available to them. So you kind of want to take your enrollment dates open to every other student and go backwards. And so you might think, well, I think if I get students accepted by March, that's good because then we'll go through all the process as well. But you know what? That might be too late. You might have to back that up to December because maybe the acceptance date is too close to that enrollment date and you need more time. So you need to make sure all those dates of admissions to enrollment work together. Okay. 251. I think each one of these could have been a whole thing, but I'll just touch on this. So this just goes back to the existing systems again. Don't reinvent the wheel. Take the wheel and modify it. So use what's already being done because that makes everybody happy. To recreate new is really difficult. And it just reinforces the fact that these students are maybe not typical students, maybe different, well, you don't want that. Again, it's not an experience, it is an education. And so to really get a good advisory board going, steering committee, whatever you want to call it, really need to have all the folks from those key areas of student affairs, financial services, academic affairs, res life, counseling, career, and disability services at the table. And so, student affairs handles everything that's not academics, right? Really. And so, they touch on the clubs and organizations, yes, and that's what most people think of with student affairs. But so importantly is the policies, okay? And I'll just use an example of Title IX. That is a huge issue with students. If there is any question about some kind of a Title IX issue, well, if you have student affairs in on the ground floor and you're making sure that all of those departments are covered in the university that knows about these students, knows why they're there, knows what access they have, knows that they're to be considered a student, also understands that these are students with an intellectual disability, okay? And so proactively, maybe there is an additional policy. Remember my policy plus? Well, maybe this is a policy plus. So a student that might have an issue with a Title IX situation, well, there is a little bit of a policy that they have lead staff advocate with them or the XYZ. I'm not telling you what to do on that, but it does need to be thought to try to cover as many bases as you can. And financial services, that CTP is so critical, and that takes lots and lots of involvement with the financial arm, the registrar, lots of work on their part. So you really need them on the ground floor. Scholarship grant organization, the folks that handle that at the university, because when you do get a scholarship or when you do get that opportunity, well, they're already aware of these students. You don't have to go in and say, hey, we got this expansion for a scholarship, but did you know we have these students? You don't want that to happen. You want them to already, oh yeah, okay, we have this grant or scholarship expanded. We have these students. Let's do it. Academic affairs, the tutoring and instructor training for education. Hopefully those students are working with the existing tutoring center, that there's not something that has to be created. Hopefully you're giving the opportunities of those tutors or grad students or upperclassmen. Well, those students have great experiences tutoring students with intellectual disability. And, don't take that opportunity away from them, really, by trying to do something all by itself, right? Instructor training is such a huge part of academic affairs. So the instructors actually know what's to be expected of them. Because if you don't inform them how this works, they will fill in the blanks and it's not going to be positive. Okay. So you want to make sure that you're giving them good information up front for those instructors, and they have proactive training before those students ever hit the campus. Res life. Oh gosh. I think I need to stop to let there be some time for questions because it's 2:55, but lots of, basically all the key departments need to be in the ground floor to collaborate and understand. And the reason why, obviously, the outcomes are incredible. The reason that this is done is because it does drive students to have much better competitive integrated employment and have a better life. So I know I raced through that last slide. I knew I would, but I'll put it up again.
Oh, thank
Does
you.
anybody have-
Thank you. Yep. Thank you, Julie. Katie had to leave. We've got an advisory committee meeting back to back here. Before we wrap up, are there any specific questions of that you'd like to ask Julie? I know we went through a lot of information. I did put in the chat, when Julie was talking about admissions, our March Learning Community event, we actually have a couple of colleagues from Millersville University. They've actually taken a different approach, and their admission for students with intellectual and developmental disabilities is the same as any other student that's applying and attending their university. So we have them coming, and they'll be sharing sort of what that looks like on their campus. And that is another resource or way to you look at and consider what would work best for your campus. Great. Well, if there aren't any, oh, Sherry, did you have a question?
I just want to ask if we've gotten any of the follow-up materials, because I still haven't gotten anything. And I want to be able to share that out with some of the people who are in our group with Christian and I and can't attend because they're teaching at this time. And I just don't want them to fall so far behind that they get off our committee. So I want to keep asking those questions. Sorry.
No, it's no worries. We're a little behind, so I apologize. But I know some of we have already sent. I think we resent to you.
I haven't gotten any.
Okay, so we must have some sort of a hiccup. So
Okay.
I'll afterwards, I'll follow up with you and we kind of figure out what's happening.
Yep,
For
no
you,
worries.
because
Kristen, have you gotten any? Okay.
I think it was just like the first one or two so far that
Okay.
we've done.
All right.
So
I'll put him
anyway,
in charge.
okay.
Disperse
All right,
those.
no worries. Thank you. We appreciate you. We'll
you
look
all.
forward to seeing you guys next week. Thanks, Julie.
Thank you, Julie.